Welcome to the Sustainable Dish Podcast. I'm Diana Rogers, a real food registered dietitian, author, and sustainability advocate. I co-host this podcast with James Connolly, who was a producer on my film, Sacred Cow. I also founded the Global Food Justice Alliance, an initiative advocating for the inclusion of animal-sourced foods like meat, dairy, and eggs for a more nutritious, sustainable, and equitable worldwide food system. You can check it out and join me at globalfoodjustice.org. Thanks again for listening, and now on to our show.
Okay, we're all set. Hi, this is James Connolly for Sustainable Dish Podcast. I have a guest on today that I am actually really excited about. Excited meaning I can't necessarily say it's an exciting topic in some sort of ways. It's sort of it's a really interesting aspect of the world that I kind of coexist with now. Where I get to really just interview people that I find absolutely fascinating, who I think are bringing in topics that I think are sort of seminal points that are part of the idea of sustainability and going forward into the 21st century as to what kind of world that do we want to live in. And so I brought on Oliver Milman. He wrote a book that just came out recently. It's called The Insect Crisis: The Fall of the Tiny Empires That Run the World. And Oliver is he's a writer for The Guardian and just a really interesting person. One of the things I kind of wanted to start with this is you have a passage in your book where you kind of talk about it's as early as like 1935, we had entomologists talking about the insect crisis, primarily focused on pesticides, but also focused on a number of different aspects of the way that we were converting the biomass of the world in order to create civilization and to feed ourselves. The conversion of that biomass, meaning that we were, in essence, really, for lack of a better term, destroying the biodiversity of the world in order to sort of create a sort of 20th century industrialized farming and agricultural movement that has sort of moved out into the rest of the world. So Oliver, thank you so much for coming on and taking the time. Thank you so much for this book as well.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, James. It's really good to be here and chat about these topics. It's really important. I think the importance of it really kind of dawned on me through writing this book. So it's good to actually kind of get into some of this stuff because I feel it's going to be some of the defining themes of this kind of century and beyond, really, when we're thinking about the kind of issues that we're confronted with in terms of our own sustainability, in terms of society and so on. So yeah, these are really good issues to get into.
So I kind of want to talk about, you have multiple stories in the book of scientists who kind of came into studying insect decline primarily because they had seen a fundamental shift in their childhood from any number of the degree of biodiversity that they had grown up with. And it could be even just like scraping insects off of the glass of long road trips when they were kids growing up and seeing a decline in the number of insects that are on their windshields. But they, in essence, became passion projects. Was that something that occurred with you as well?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, I mean, a lot of this kind of came from anecdote, from kind of just talking to scientists about other things, and then realizing there was this kind of silent emergency going on with insects, and yet a lot of them could put their finger on it because there wasn't the data, and there still is kind of a lack of data in certain places in the world, such as the tropics, where most of insect life lives. But in the last kind of 4, 5, 6 years, we've been getting this kind of drip of research coming out from various countries around the world showing these kind of quite incredible declines in insect numbers. It's just the problem is before that there didn't seem to be any point to counting. I mean, why would you count insects? I mean, they're everywhere, aren't they?
Hmm.
they're around us to an annoying extent at times. It feels like biting us and spiraling around our lights or around our heads when we're outside. So it never really seemed important to conduct any kind of population trend analysis on them. It was always far more interesting for entomologists and valuable, scientifically valuable, to discover new species, to name new behaviors and so on. So
Mm.
it's only in the last kind of 4 or 5 years we've begun to get a kind of handle on what's happening with insect numbers. And the signs aren't great. It's pretty grim. We're seeing some pretty alarming declines, kind of the kind of numbers you don't really see in conservation biology often. I mean,
Hmm.
I kind of like to talk about how the world's lost about 95% of the world's of the world's tigers, but we've done that over kind of 150 years of kind of hunting, habitat loss, and so on. In some parts of the world, we've been losing kind of 80, 90, 95% of insects in just kind of 30, 40 years. There's that kind of seminal study that came out of Germany showing 3/4 of flying insects by biomass had declined in nature reserves there since 1989. So, since the time that the Berlin Wall has fallen down, Germany's lost 3/4 of its flying insects in its most
Mm.
protected areas, which is kind of incredible when you think about it like that. There's studies from kind of Puerto Rico, from Denmark, certain other places in the US, Australia. UK's lost half of its butterflies in the last 50 years. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on, really. It's quite a kind of grim tale, but it kind of tells us a lot, I think, about the way we've conducted our lives, how we've ordered the world around us, and how that's completely the polar opposite to what insects need.
Hmm.
We kind of have diametrically opposed um, ways of ordering our lives to the interests of insects, and I think it's coming back to bite us now. No pun intended.
Yeah, you have this wonderful metaphor in the book where you kind of talk about old sort of 70s photographs of people who had gone fishing, and a sort of ordered development of the next 30 or 40 years where you see people holding up fish and they're getting smaller and smaller. But to that younger generation that wouldn't necessarily understand that there is a cause to that, because that is their new normal. And I think one of the cautionary tales that I always try to tell me, a mantra I tell myself, is that looking at a degraded landscape now and saying that this is normal, it is one of the fears that we have, kind of going into the climate crisis. You know.
Yeah, the kind of shifting baseline syndrome. What was normal to
Hmm.
us won't be normal to our children and grandchildren. And I think that those photographs of shrinking catches of fish off the fishing tools off the Florida Keys are a really good example of that, in that
Hmm.
people aren't disappointed generation after generation that their catches got smaller, because to them
Hmm.
it's normal. It's normal that you would only catch a fish that's you know the size of your forearm, whereas before you would be getting fish the size of you. um, so that's the issue with climate change, and it's the issue with insects. I mean, there is this kind of shorthand of the windshield effect that scientists talk about, which is, as you mentioned before, the bugs that are smeared across your windshield after you take a drive across country. And I think for people of a certain age, I certainly remember that being an issue when I was growing up in England and driving across country with my mum and my brother, and you'd see bugs on the windshield at the end of the trip, and that was quite normal. Now that's becoming less so. You kind of speak to lots of people who notice now that that's becoming less and less of a thing. I kind of spent some time in Montana last year. I was driving around for about a week in some very kind of remote areas of Montana, not a single bug on my windshield
Hmm.
at the end of that week. And that's a kind of very sparsely populated part of the US. It's not somewhere you think would be short of insects, but we're seeing these kind of incredible kind of changes to kind of live memory almost. But to the next generation, that's not going to seem unusual. It's
Hmm.
not going to seem unusual to have, um, you know, a windshield clear of bugs, to go outside on a summer's day and not have insects circling the light, or buzzing around you, that's going to seem the new baseline, and that's what we have kind of have to be aware of and think about when we think about what is normal in kind of quotation marks.
Yeah, so you talk a lot in the book about the media response to some of these reports that came out specifically in Germany and in Denmark about insect declines, and a lot of it was hyperbolic. But you also kind of go through some of the scientists who didn't necessarily want to be sort of put into the spotlight on this, or their research uh, to be sort of galvanized in a way that would get the public involved in this. But now they almost, some of them will actually kind of come back and say, well, this was really a warning sign. And we should be taking Insectageddon or any number of different headlines that kind of came out. How are you feeling about it now? I mean, you're, yeah, so let's go with that.
Yeah, sure. Well, I feel quite conflicted on the Insectageddon and insect apocalypse, because it is hyperbolic in many respects. We're not going to lose all insects. We're going to almost certainly depart this planet before insects do as a
Right.
species. They are the great survivors. They were here before dinosaurs. They've survived 5 mass extinctions, through their adaptability, through obviously their range and breadth of numbers and species. So there's always been species that squeezed through those kind of bottlenecks of extinctions. We're now kind of entering what many scientists believe is the 6th mass extinction of life on Earth, and it's hammering insects just like it's hammering many other creatures in the world, but they will survive in some form beyond this. So we shouldn't be thinking that they're going to be completely wiped out. I think the kind of issue for us from a kind of selfish human centric point of view is that we're destroying many of the kind of insects that we really value, the ones that pollinate our food, being the primary example of that. The butterflies that give us kind of beauty and solace in the world. The things that we find really valuable and pretty and worthwhile. And we're creating a world that is kind of warmer and damper in a lot of places, and obviously with a growing global population, one with more people and more waste and so on. And those are great conditions for mosquitos and cockroaches and bed bugs and all the things we dislike. So sure, we won't lose insects, but if we have one with an insect world with far more bed bugs and mosquitos and far fewer bumblebees and monarch butterflies, I don't think that's a trade most of us would want to make. It's not something I think we would welcome, and it would have, and it is having, profound implications in terms of our food production, in terms of those kind of vital ecosystem services to keep kind of forests and grasslands and everything around us healthy and functioning, and it's having an impact upon the food chain. I mean, a lot of scientists said to me, well, it's hard for us to get people to care about insects, but they care about birds and they care about amphibians and they care about other creatures, and we're already seeing in some places of the world declines of birds that specialize in eating insects because they have nothing to eat. So you've seen these kind of cascading kind of issues rolling through the through the world, and I think the worry is that it starts hitting limits to hurt us. We need a certain amount of pollination for the food we produce. We need ecosystem services to break down waste and dead bodies and so on. We need these things for things to keep ticking over. So we're kind of pulling away at those kind of life support systems a little bit, from a kind of selfish point of view, as well as for all other life on Earth. So I think there is alarm to be had there. It's not apocalyptic in a kind of biblical sense, but it's something we should be worried about and should be far more focused on and doing something about.
Well, I have to be honest with you. When I first bought your book, I had to put it down. It was much more terrifying than I would have expected. And I do read a lot of the worst thing that humans have done in human history. I had to sort of pick it up again with the notion that we're going to get to a place where, because I don't think we can conceptualize in many different ways the degree to which our food production system is really heavily dependent on not just honeybees, but wild pollinators as well. And so I wonder if you can dig into that a little bit, throw some numbers out at me. Like when I walk through the supermarket, what percentage of the foods that I see that are not packaged in the middle aisles are heavily dependent upon, wild pollinators and, honeybees, and what is happening with it, that the pollinator species. Um,
Sure. So the kind of figure that always gets bandied about is about 1 in every 3 bites of food is reliant upon animal
mm,
pollinators. I mean, that figure can vary depending on what kind of source you're looking at. Um, but certainly about a third of the world's food crops depend on animal pollinators in some way, and animals can mean kind of bats, but they
mhm,
primarily mean insects. Insects are doing the brunt of that work. Bees are the forefront. They get celebrated for that work. We all kind of love bees. The second most important pollinator is flies, which we celebrate far less. We think are
mhm,
pointless and we'd all want to kill. I think very few of us appreciate that without flies, we'd have no chocolate, because the
mhm,
tiny midge is what gets inside the cacao plant to pollinate it. So you've got
mhm,
this $100 billion a year industry that's completely dependent on a tiny little midge. I don't think any of us would, you know, praise any flies when we're eating some Lindt or Hershey's or whatever, but
mhm,
that's what's creating it, and there's no real substitute for it. So the value of food produced by insect pollination is about $500 billion a year. It's everything from coffee, chocolate, apples, cranberries,
mhm,
melons, almonds, broccoli,
mhm,
blueberries, cherries. I mean, the list kind of goes on and on. It's essentially the kind of all the colourful stuff on your plate that's nutritious and healthy. And there's
mhm,
already kind of some concern that as pollination services become stretched, as the global population rises, there's a huge increase in pollination demand. I mean, there's already been something like a 300% increase in pollination demand over the last 50 years, at a time when the
mhm,
population is obviously growing and pollinators are coming under these stresses. There's already concern that we're going to start seeing instances of disease and malnutrition cropping up in the poorer parts of the world, of course, um, unfortunately, because of this lack of pollination. Because in a lot of developing countries, the pollination services are very directly impacting in terms of food source. You have a plot of land and you farm it yourself.
mhm,
You sustain yourself through your own labors. So whereas in supermarkets in the US, you'll probably start paying a little bit more money for certain fruits and vegetables. I think is fair enough to to imagine that scenario. Um, uh, in other parts of the world, they just won't be available. Obviously, for poorer people in the US and Europe and other countries, it's going to be out of reach.
mhm,
You already have the issue of obviously, um, uh, you know, healthy food deserts, don't you? Where people can't access enough kind of nutritious food. And I think this is only going to add to that problem, because it's going to be pushing certain foods out of reach financially.
mhm,
And so, yeah, we're kind of moving to that. And there's already research showing that yields of certain fruits and vegetables in the US and Canada are declining.
mhm,
Blueberries and cherries, I think, were the products subject to that recent research, because they just simply can't get the pollination needed. So I think that's the issue. And the United Nations has warned there's going to be a food security crisis that's going to be slowly unfolding this century. Something we're going to have to be thinking about quite carefully, as these kind of various trends kind of collide with each other. Very
mhm,
unhelpful trends colliding with each other.
mhm. You recently came back from COP27. Did you go to speak or just to report?
Just to report, yeah, it's a kind of manic place, and there's a huge amount going on. Food managed to get it get into the kind of cover text into the agreement fairly high up for the first time.
Hmm.
So there is a kind of recognition that agriculture and food is part of this problem, affected by it, feeds into it. So there is that growing recognition. But I mean, overall, this COP was pretty much a failure when it comes to cutting emissions. There was the kind of triumph of this new loss and damage fund for developing countries to help them deal with climate impacts. But overall, I can't say that we could say this was a success, because
Hmm.
we are going entirely in the wrong directions when it comes to emissions, and this conference did pretty much nothing to averting that.
Yeah, the director for my last film was a presenter over at COP27, and it was the same. We just podcasted about it yesterday, but she said it was utter chaos. It was even really hard to find places to eat while you were
Yeah,
there. So
it
um,
was. Yeah, there
she
was
said
no
it was
food for the
confusing.
first few days. No water. I think it was on the third or fourth day, there was literally a river of raw sewage that started flowing out towards
Oh
the exit,
goodness.
where people were getting taxis and buses. And that, I think, for many of us, summed up the whole process. That there was literal feces everywhere. But
God.
that yeah, it wasn't very well organized. There was the kind of concerns about surveillance and issues of
Mhm.
human rights due to the repressive regime of El-Sisi, the Egyptian autocrat. So there were quite a lot of issues bound up in it. A lot of people felt it was one of the worst COPs when it comes to organization, and
Mm.
yeah, that didn't help the overall vibe. The overall
Mhm.
vibe was not amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just really disappointing, I think. You really want it- we're sort of living in this realm where I think there is hyper attention focused on what we're determining to be sustainable and ecologically friendly, that supports biodiversity, but also feeds people nutrient dense foods. And as we're shuttling into these sort of goals of 2030, 2050, it's really hard to see the level of chaos that's kind of happening even at these places that should be well funded and at least come up with some degree of consensus about one thing.
Yeah,
Right? When Coca-Cola was sponsoring it, and you just get this level of incredulity that's happening within the people in the sphere.
yeah. I think it really show. I think the last few years have really shown us about the limits of consensus, right? I mean,
Mm,
you have to get nearly 200 countries to agree to something,
yeah.
and Russia and Saudi Arabia are not going to agree to phasing out coal and oil and gas. I mean, that's just not. That's the entire basis of their economies. Then that's not in their interest. Um, so they're going to block any language that goes into an agreement that states
Hmm.
as such. I mean, we're finding it hard, although there is this kind of growing climate movement, obviously driven by young people, Greta Thunberg, and the developing world. They have the kind of moral standing to kind of demand more on this, and we're seeing some really good kind of pressure building from that. But
Hmm.
in terms of getting us all um, as a world to agree on this, it's really hard. I mean, it's like one of those kind of alien movies where in the movie you see everyone in the world united to defeat the alien
Oh, right.
presence. I mean, it just wouldn't happen, would it? I mean, half of us would want to fight, half of us would think it's a hoax, it's not happening.
Right.
Some people would think, it's a good thing the aliens are coming to destroy our cities, or you know,
Right.
we can't all agree whether to get vaccines or wear a mask for a pandemic. We can't all agree on, you know, basic ideas of democracy in elections. I mean, these are, it's hard to find consensus on things at the moment, and uh, I think COP is a really good example of that. It's been 30 years of trying to herd cats, trying to
Hmm.
get countries to agree to something, and only kind of getting kind of inching progress towards those shared goals.
Yeah, and then getting people to care about insects. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
And,
Publishing a book in the wake of a pandemic, when there's war going on in Europe, and
yeah.
energy and food prices are going up, and you're saying, "Hey, what about the insects?" But I
Yeah.
mean, these things are all intertwined, aren't they? They're all
Yeah,
interlinked.
absolutely.
We need to get a handle on, getting a handle on the insect crisis. I think we'll get a handle on lots of other things too that benefit not just insects but humans too.
Yeah, you have a point in the book that I actually found fairly profound. I was reading Charles Mann's book, Wizard and the Prophet, and he makes the case that if we weren't dealing specifically with climate change, heating of the planet, our secondary concern would probably be nitrogen pollution. As a close second. I would actually put your work and the work of a lot of these entomologists up there as well. I think it would probably be one of the primary crises of our time is dealing with the insect decline. I think it is a crisis. And you kind of talk about what is charismatic megafauna when we're talking about uh, diversity, but really we are losing an enormous number of species that would just never get back again in the insect world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And we have these kind of inbuilt biases, don't we, about what's important and what's worth saving. And
Hmm.
we spend an inordinate amount of time, conservation dollars, and effort into saving, the things we think are, totemic and important and, charismatic in our world. And those are, tigers and lions and elephants and rhinos and so on. And these things are important, and they're important because intrinsically they deserve their space in the world, and they're important ecologically too. But in terms of their ecological importance, they're nowhere near the breadth of impact that insects have, especially selfishly for our own needs. I mean, rhinos could die out and it wouldn't really affect us. Should insects die out, I think E.O. Wilson, the great biologist, said we would all perish within kind of 3 to 4 months. I mean, we'd be struck down by kind of mass starvation. Ecosystems around us would start failing. It would just be a really miserable place. It wouldn't be one we would survive very long in. So we have this huge mismatch, this kind of cultural misappropriation of where our affections lie,
Hmm.
in that we kind of see insects as kind of, largely we see them as kind of pointless or annoying or irrelevant, where they're the ones actually piloting this plane. We're at the
Hmm.
back sipping the martinis, right? We're not actually the ones driving this with giraffes and rhinos
Hmm.
and tigers. We're at the back, and insects and fungi and bacteria and all these other little things, plants, are actually the ones propping up
Hmm.
life on Earth, and we're kind of pulling away some of those support structures without really thinking about it.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to let you know that I am running a special 50% off discount for the month of January for my Sustainable course. If you're struggling with holiday weight gain or finally ready to regenerate your health, it's a great time to take my course. As you know, modern diets plus polluted environments, lack of sleep, and chronic stress are largely to blame for the explosion in chronic health issues over the past century. But diet is one of the biggest changes you can take control of right now. You'll learn how to set and track your protein goals, which foods to include and what to avoid, and I have tons of info on sourcing the right ingredients. So if you're ready to reclaim your health in 2023 using real food nutrition, go to sustainavore.com and enter code JAN50 for 50% off the course. You'll get instant access to 8 easy-to-follow modules, 60 days of inspiring emails, 20 hours of bonus videos, a free cookbook, and more bonuses. Again, this offer is only good in the month of January 2023. It ends on February 1st, and so you need to take advantage now. Go to sustainavore.com and enter code JAN50.
Right. Do you find it somewhat annoying that we're so hyper focused on the microbiome of our own bodies, but also not extrapolating that to the outside world. I mean, if we don't have, like, I actually spend a lot of time thinking about dung beetles now,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
You know, right. So unless you have detritivores, unless you have carnivorous insects or omnivorous insects, we are going to, none of the waste that we produce, human waste, or otherwise, are just, we're not going to have a functioning system. But when people talk about the microbiome, it's like all of this research funding is being thrown at this. But I'm like, this Earth, this sort of Gaia planet, is the same thing. And if you want a soil food web, if you want a web of life, we have to start to look at these keystone species like the dung beetle. We have to start to look at them in sort of a, you know, pull some glory to their function, not just for us, right?
Yeah, yeah, entirely. I think unfortunately though, it's a bit like climate changes. We don't really appreciate the changes underway until they're kind of smacking us around the face, right? Whether
Mm,
it's a record heat wave or the floods we've seen in Pakistan or whatever that may be. I think with dung beetles, there's a great example of that smacking us around the faces when European settlers arrived in Australia, started moving cattle there,
mm,
and realized that the native insects could not break down the dung of cattle. So you started getting this poisoning of the land, essentially. Whole
mm,
tracts of land became infertile, couldn't be used because it was just caked in cow dung. And they actually had to bring over dung beetles from Europe to help
mm,
break it down. I mean, there was posed a kind of existential threat to farming in Australia. This kind of mismatch, um, but that kind of loss isn't apparent to us most of the time. We don't
mm,
think about these services. Insects do all these kind of things in the background, um, without keeping things ticking over, without us really paying much attention to them.
mhm.
We would very much notice them if they weren't around. I think one entomologist put it really well when she told me in the book, it'd be like a river of poo everywhere, and dead Uncle Jeremy would be floating on past you, because
It's a
all
memorable
the,
line, I'll tell you.
yeah, all these kind of horrible things would happen if
Yeah.
it wasn't for insects. But we tend not to think about that. We don't think about things that could happen but don't.
Mm,
We tend to think about things that are happening to us right now and how we deal with them. We can react quickly to wars and pandemics and things immediate crises that seize us. Um, but these kind of long unfolding, slow emergencies, we're not so good at confronting.
mhm. So I want to kind of pivot a little bit because you have some really great stuff towards the end where you're kind of talking about how farming in general, but people in general can be part of a solution with some caveats, right? Milkweed and honeybee. It seems like a lot of people get into honeybee farming. I want to kind of talk a little bit about the caveats with it, but also to kind of talk about how people who are listening to this podcast can sort of build ecosystems that function really well on an individual level to help support bringing insects back and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think farming and food production is a huge part of the problem, but also solution of how we dig ourselves out of many different messes. I mean, the climate crisis being one, and insect declines being another. I mean, we're already seeing some good work being done in Europe with connecting wildlife corridors, encouraging and
Hmm.
paying farmers to have these kind of borders of fields, so that you can grow kind of spices or wildflowers or whatever it is, and have a network running through the landscape where insects can live and move around and breed and so on. And that then has this kind of obviously beneficial effect, because you then have more insects around to help pollinate the crops and also eat the pests that
Hmm.
you don't want around. I mean,
Hmm.
wasps, many people don't like wasps, but they eat
Hmm.
they eat aphids and things that you don't want on your crops. So um, th- there is kind of some promising signs of a new way of doing it, but I think unfortunately the status quo in much of the world, including the US, primarily the US, in fact, is one of monocultural farming practices, huge, sprawling fields of single crops, doused in chemicals, with very little fringing plants, cut right up to the road, up to the border, no kind of wildness there at all, and hugely toxic. I mean, by one measure, US agriculture has become 48 times more toxic to insect life than it has in the last 25 years, because this constant layering of chemicals, most notably neonicotinoids, which is this class of insecticides that's very, very good at killing insects, just all kinds of insects, not just the target ones, everything, wiping them out. It's about 7,000 times more toxic to bees than DDT, which obviously that kind of famous target of Silent Spring, the book by Rachel Carson, that saw the decline of bald eagles. And what's more un-American than that, mobilized the environmental movement that saw the phase out of DDT. But unfortunately, you've replaced DDT with something that's in many respects even worse. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in kind of stamping out the use of neonicotinoids. I mean, the European Union has already banned 3 of the worst types of neonics. The US could do the same. The EPA has chosen not to, even though it's been found in lettuce, in baby food, in onions, in people's urine. I mean, these chemicals are everywhere now.
Pregnant mothers.
Exactly, ubiquitous. So I think there is a kind of good case for kind of pushing for reform on that. But I do think farmers are thinking a bit more now about these issues, because they're seeing the impacts. I think they're seeing the impacts of pollinator loss. I mean, it's become so kind of automated and sterile now. I mean, I went to Central Valley in California as part of the book to see this kind of mass trucking of managed honeybee hives somewhere around the country to the Central Valley to pollinate almonds each year. And it's just an incredible kind of effort just to prop up the existing food system using a bee that's not native to the US. It was imported. It's now being kind of used as a kind of contracted agricultural worker, a kind of input like a tractor, or a chemical or something like that. And they're kind of carted around the country pollinating different things, and without them the whole system would start wobbling, because there aren't enough wild bees out there to produce the food that yields that we have come used to. So the whole system, I think, needs a rethink, and but we're seeing some kind of green shoots of progress on that, I'd like to think.
I think with almond production, especially the resniks have really dominated Californian almond pistachio agriculture for so long, and they seem to be completely outside of the spectrum of anything that any farmer like. And they're just billionaires, right? But it is sort of strange that you can see pesticide application happening in and around the same time period when pollinators are being released into these almond orchards. And you're just looking at it and you're just like, one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. It's so strange to me. But we've done some drone footage of almond plantations in California, and it just goes on forever and ever.
It's not a wild environment, is it? It's a kind of factory floor. It's an outdoor factory floor of food production. That's essentially what it is, and everything that's unproductive has been taken out. That doesn't create cash, so you don't see many wildflowers or hedgerows or anything like that. You just see rows and rows of crops, and that has become the model of farming that has, in many ways, proved successful in terms of increasing yields of food, but it's come at a cost, and we've taken a big chunk out of our environmental budget, if you like, by doing things that way.
I think 80% of the world's almonds come from California, in the Central Valley. And just the irrigation and groundwater depletion is if you're talking about migratory birds or aquatic species of insects, the groundwater depletion is just so absolute there. It's a total desertification that's happening. The subsidence of the land. I mean, we're talking about like not inches anymore. Was talking
Yeah.
feet in terms of subsidence. 10,000-year aquifers that are being drained.
Yeah.
All for what I would consider to be unnecessary monoculture. You could probably do what almond production is in this one area in many different places and mitigate a lot of the concerns.
Yes.
But I don't know. Just don't get me on the resnicks.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible use of space. I always think about that when especially when I fly over the US, about how America
Mm,
uses its space. I
right.
think it's a really interesting topic because there's obviously a large population, but a huge amount of land.
Mm,
And you see that land being used quite inefficiently when you look at housing, for example. Sprawling suburbs take
mm,
up a huge amount of land, none of it walkable. You need cars to get everywhere, none of it's joined up with other things, with malls or places where you work. um, that seems inefficient. The use of lawn, I found out through the book, is the largest irrigated crop in America,
yeah.
even more than corn.
Hmm.
The amount of resource that goes in, the water, pesticides, all kinds of other things to keep a kind of verdant, very boring, closely trimmed lawn that has no
Mm,
life in it. It just kind of
mm,
looks in an aesthetic that we feel our neighbors appreciate, and kind of fits in with suburban life, or whatever dream
mhm.
that entails. And farming too. I mean, yeah, like you're saying, huge tracts of land just devoted to single crops, just going on as far as the eye can see. um, the number one producer agricultural output, US. Second is the Netherlands. It's
Yeah.
about the size of Maryland. Why is the
Mhm,
Netherlands the second largest producer? It's not because it's got the most amount of land.
mhm,
It's because it does things smarter.
mm,
Vertical farming, robotics, seed, genetic stuff they're doing with that. I mean, they've done things in a smarter way, and arguably a more environmentally friendly way. Although obviously there's downsides to the way they do things too. But I think, yeah, space and how it's used in the US is a really kind of interesting topic across many different areas.
yeah. I kind of wanted to, yeah, I mean, one of the interesting points that you make in the book is, in some ways, how you feel about uh, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in England. You have looked at that landscape in a very different way. You have a passage where you're kind of talking about old growth forests, peatlands, bogs. The it is much more of an aesthetically pleasing place, but the level of biodiversity loss that's even happened in places like England, is really like is problematic, right?
Yeah, it is. And again, it's the baseline syndrome. I mean,
Hmm.
when I was growing up in the UK, beauty was these kind of rolling fields, nice little stone walls, hedgerows, sheep in the fields, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
But that isn't the aesthetic that was there up until a few hundred years ago. Most of the country was forested, and that's
Hmm.
now being pretty much entirely chopped down. You have these remnants of temperate rainforests, which you mentioned there.
Hmm.
You had those kind of clinging on the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia too, Tasmania, Chile, some places like that. But these really are just fragments, remnants of what once was there. And yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to think about what we consider to be beautiful, what we consider to be normal.
Hmm.
Um, just going back to the lawns, I think a lot of us
Yeah.
think that a very tidy lawn is beautiful,
Right.
normal. Uh, Very colourful plants in there that aren't native plants. They're
Yeah.
kind of pretty. Um, and it's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? In terms of
Yeah.
sustaining insect life, in terms of creating kind of vibrant ecosystems around you, these are quite dead, kind of lifeless places. And we are, like I was saying, paying the price for that now.
Yeah, lawns are sort of a weird leftover from the aristocracy, because I think a lot of that stuff was centered around the closing of the commons, and then you would build out these places and hand cut lawns. because if it wasn't associated with agricultural production, then obviously it was an inherent good. So these gardens that were kind of part of that,
Right.
it's like it produces nothing except an aesthetically like manicured landscape that was part of kind of industrialization and all this other stuff.
Sure.
So the American middle class kind of just took it on as like a show of support of wealth, and a cultural construct.
Yes.
The planned divisions that were associated with like Disney. Remember, Disney had this planned community. The lawns couldn't exceed more than 1.5 inches, or you'd be fined.
Yeah.
Suburbia, urban sprawl, and all of that stuff.
The dream. Yes.
The dream.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's your book is such an important element to our understanding of how we want to build a world that is part of putting biodiversity on a scale that would harken back to even just our grandfathers and great grandfathers. I think that there is it's such an important part of it, and I think you had a term in there. It's like it's an invisible crisis or something like that. I think we have to bring more visibility to this, especially people in cities. I think need to really understand that what we're building is monoculture, planet-wide monocultures. So thank you so much for the book. I did say it was terrifying. It is terrifying, Oliver. It's terrifying. But I do think you build a world that I would want my kids to live in and my grandchildren to live in. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, James. It's very generous for you to say. And yeah, if you can get beyond the terror in the book, there's certainly some interesting things about how we can move forward from there. And there's also some pretty cool facts about bees. They can play soccer and they can recognize each other by face, and they can count and things like that. So there's lots of interesting insect facts in there too. So it's not just doom and gloom.
No, and one of the things that you made me like really reconcile myself with is that I mean, if you're looking at flies in a different way as pollinators, in the book you say they operate longer hours and they can tolerate colder conditions, and they are effective pollinators. So getting people to kind of start to re-see what we consider pests as profitable to all of it is really important.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So how will people reach you? You're on Twitter, I believe.
Yes, for now. Yeah, at the time of broadcast, yes. Yeah, I'm still on Twitter, and you can find me on The Guardian. My byline's on there. So yeah, hope people can engage with the writing. A lot of my writing is in obviously this vein. So yeah, check out my work there.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for tuning in to the Sustainable Dish podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review on iTunes and check out my website at sustainabledish.com, where you can sign up for my newsletter, catch up on the latest blog post, and check out my courses and favorite products. See you next time, and thanks again for listening.